Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Allow me to present another episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll be reading chapter numero 11 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. Chapter 11 is called Party. Here we go. There was considerable rivalry among the various rock and roll bands at that time over which of us were having the most fun on the road. Led Zeppelin were considered to be the world masters, with bands like the Rolling Stones and the Who a close second. Hotel rooms would be ceremoniously trashed, industrial quantities of drugs and alcohol consumed, and excesses logged in folklore. By comparison, we were Little League, but the one area we did excel at was in attracting women. We were young, famous, good-looking, and rich. We made it to the big time and were right up there on the list of rock star scalps the eager groupies wanted to add to their belts. Glenn once publicly described our life on the road as got crazy, got drunk, got high, had girls, played music, and made money. He challenged Led Zeppelin to the claim of supreme party animals, maintaining, "We threw the greatest traveling party of the 70s. He was right. It wasn't just the regular groupies who were on offer. Adoring female fans of all ages, sizes, shapes, and colors threw themselves at us. Songs like The Best of My Love, Desperado, and Witchy Woman were heartwarming numbers that appealed predominantly to a female audience. They were, I soon realized, highly effective lures. Night after night during On the Border and now on this tour, I witnessed the barrage of that was offered up. It was a sweet storm of women. They were literally everywhere, in hotels, at shows, and on planes. Before one of these nights, the system of pairing up those who wanted to get laid and the women who were more than happy to oblige had been a bit haphazard. As a band, we had a policy of only ever doing two-song encores, and that was now used to our advantage. While we were on stage wooing the fans, trusted road crew would be asked to scout the audience for willing participants and offer them backstage passes for what became known as the third encore, the party after the show. Each was handed a laminated pass with the words 3E, the Eagles, printed on it in Gothic lettering. These passes became popular souvenirs. While the stadium was being cleared and the traffic was dying away, the band, crew, managers, promoters, local radio DJs, and just about anyone else associated with this business would remain backstage to meet the 40 or so attractive young women who had been hand-picked. Some of the record company promoters would even bring Playboy girls, or special groupies for the occasion, along with copious amounts of cocaine and champagne. For the latest tour, however, Don and Glenn took the system to a higher level of sophistication. The laminated passes were dispensed with being too indiscreet. In their place were specially made little buttons, small, round, beveled like a campaign button with a pin on the back and 3E written on them in yellow English Gothic on a black background. Very discreet. They were passed out to the road crew by the handful. They would hand them to the loveliest girls in the audience. Some crew members would even loiter by the ladies' bathrooms, eyeing the girls as they walked in and out. The message was that the Eagles were having a party and would like to invite these women back to their hotel suite. No boyfriends were ever invited. When the show was over, no matter how much the crowd hollered for a third encore, threw beer cans or lit all the lighters and matches they possessed, we were out of there. The house lights would be kept dim as we ran from the stage and bolted out the back door and into waiting limos before the audience even knew we left the building. Only after we were well ahead of all the traffic would the lights come up, and everyone would wander home clutching their t-shirts, programs, and memories. Back at our hotel, a suite would have been specially reserved for that night's third encore party, stocked with ice buckets full of beer, wine, and champagne, platters of hors d'oeuvres, and bowls of chips. By the time we all showered and changed in our rooms, the first of the 50 or so invitees would be arriving, desperate to meet us, their little buttons pinned proudly to their chests. I can remember walking down the corridor toward the suite one night and bumping into a man we called the party doctor. He was carrying a huge prescription bottle, the size of a large mayonnaise jar, full of Quaaludes, then the recreational drug of choice to distribute among our guests at the party, if they wanted them. If one of the guys in the room wanted to select a girl to be taken back to a bedroom and laid, then it fulfilled the objectives of both parties. Seldom was a girl allowed to spend more than a couple hours with the featured participant. Almost never could she stay overnight. A limo driver downstairs was entrusted to ferry them all home. On certain occasions in certain towns, specific women known to be group sex girls would have a suite of their own. I never experienced any of that, but I heard a lot about it from others on the road. Little Rock Connie was a legend. Allegedly a school teacher by day, at night she transformed herself into a sexual animal par excellence, asking people to take Polaroids of her while they stood in line for a... To this day, if you mention her name to anyone in this business from the 70s, it'll produce a smile. To begin with, I watched in amazement all that was going on, but tried to keep my hands clean. I felt totally out of my league. You could count on one hand the girls I had. However, by the time one of these nights' tours really got going, the 3E parties were organized to perfection, and so entirely accepted as normal that I completely lost sight of who I was. I'd like to tell you I was a saint, and that's exactly what I'd have had to have been to resist the temptations thrust at me on a daily basis. Some of these women were goddesses. I mean, really beautiful, sexy women. I had no interest in breaking up my marriage or spoiling what I had at home, but life on the road, especially in a band short on camaraderie, was extremely lonely. I'd go from a real adrenaline rush on stage with all these women screaming and yelling and throwing themselves at me, reaching out to me with their hands while I stood in the spotlight, back to an empty hotel room, where I'd face about 21 hours of the day in which life was incredibly boring. I was left with an overwhelming sense of isolation, which really began to erode my sense of self. No matter how long I spent on the phone with Susan, I was still utterly alone. I don't think she really understood that because she was at home, surrounded by children, friends, neighbors, going out to dinner or to the movies or being involved with the family. A big part of me wanted to be home with her and Jessie. By the summer of that year, she was pregnant again, expecting our second child, and I longed to share in every day of our baby's growth and be with her to help her through the morning sickness, the cramps, and the exhaustion. There wasn't an hour that passed when I didn't think of her. I'd imagine her sitting in her rocking chair, knitting baby clothes, and wonder what I had missed of Jessie's development. Would he even recognize me when I got home? Instead, I was thrown in with 4 crazy bachelors. Randy overlooked his marriage vows, who were doing drugs, drinking, and anything that walked. Half the time I was so high, I didn't know what I was doing anyway. It was such an extreme situation. I defy any man to resist temptation in such circumstances. After every single sexual transgression, I was racked with guilt. I'd lie awake at night, wishing for some easy way out of this heaven and hell situation I found myself in. An angel waiting for me at home, and demons taunting me when I was away. The answer usually was to take a couple of Quaaludes, which acted as a rubber hammer to bring me down from the drink and drugs high and let me get some sleep before the early morning call. It was truly the rock star life, and for better or worse, I was living it. I made no excuses for my behavior. I was led along by the crowd in the circus of life on the road. The others would have been very suspicious of me if I hadn't joined in, but for what it's worth, I can say that all the women got what they wanted, and none of them meant a thing to me. I was being used as much as I was using. I felt like 2 different people, the guy on the road being tempted by the carnal beast, and the loving homeboy who'd have gladly laid down his life for his wife and kid. When I was back in Malibu, I didn't drink, take illegal drugs, or fool around. I'd even given up smoking for a while when my son was born, so as not to be a bad example. I was a husband and a father, and I loved Susan and Jessie with all my heart. I just didn't know how to handle the perpetual struggle raging within me. Despite the relief on offer, the tensions within the band continued to deepen. Everything from facial expressions to talking too much became an issue, and nerves were frayed. Don and Glenn became of the mindset that they were going to take control of every aspect of the Eagles, and a lot of emotion was vented in between drug-taking interludes. Bernie, who had all but turned his back on the sex, drugs, and rock and roll aspect of the business, and was now into surfing, fresh air, and healthy eating, was more often than not the one to vent it. I tried my best to arbitrate and persuade him to chill, but I was frequently left straddling the fence. If Don and Glenn want to control the situation, then let them, I'd tell Bernie. It's gotta be easier than fighting all the time like this. My policy was to walk away, pretending not to care rather than have a confrontation. I knew how fame and fortune could corrupt, and I didn't want to be a part of that. But Bernie was as stubborn as a mule. He'd disappear for days to go surfing and feel the sunshine on his face. He was the first of us to adopt a healthier lifestyle and turn his back on the drugs and late nights, which were making a difficult emotional situation worse. All of us but him had major stomach problems, ulcers, acid indigestion, and diverticulitis, and lived on a diet of Malanta or Tums. Bernie's Marty Martian nickname no longer related to how curly his hair was, but to how bright and clear his eyes were compared to ours. One night about halfway through the tour, just before we were due to fly to Australia and New Zealand for the next leg, we were staying at the Holiday Inn in Cincinnati when Glenn called a band meeting in his room. We used to have a lot of band meetings in the early days, and although everyone dreaded them for what they might reveal, they were useful as a forum for discussion. The trouble was that, with everyone expressing their disparate views, there was usually conflict. I don't recall exactly what started Bernie and Glenn arguing that December evening of 1975. Maybe Bernie was going on again about us having sold out and become too commercial. Maybe everyone else was mad because Patty Davis was on the road with us again, which meant federal agents everywhere to protect her because she was the governor's daughter. The feds were an unwelcome addition, cramping the band's lifestyle, especially when it came to drugs. In any event, Glenn, sitting in the middle of the room in an aluminum chair, started in on Bernie, who was standing in the corner with a Budweiser in his hand, about how he screwed things up every time. He said something like, "You need to cool down, you hole," and emptied his entire beer over Glenn's head. All the while, he was staring him down, daring Glenn to stop him. Bernie was into karate and was super fit. Few would have taken him on. Then he stormed out the open door and onto the balcony. We sat there in amazement and watched what happened, including Glenn, who didn't move a muscle when the beer dripped down his face. I think I was the first one to move. I followed my old buddy out onto the balcony, where he was gripping the railing so hard the whites of his knuckles were showing through his skin, and I asked him what was going on. I said, "This isn't good, man." He told me he was prepared to quit. Assuming it was just one of those moments where people say something in a fit of anger, I wandered back into the room, where Glenn was toweling himself down and tried to mediate. I told him I knew the two hadn't been getting along, but if it continued like this, they'd come to blows. I could see the muscles in Glenn's jaw twitching, and I realized what a good job he had done of containing himself. Glenn said something like, "That guy's a liability," through clenched teeth. Don agreed. Randy and I looked at each other and then back at Glenn and Don. I knew in that moment that Bernie's days with the band were probably numbered. The tour was cut short, and when we got back to L.A., Bernie packed up his guitar and surfboard and took off for Hawaii, where he bought a house. He decided to write his own songs and record a solo album of the type of music he liked. He had been in and out of several bands in the past and had been through bust-ups before. I think he thought he'd just move on to his next project. When asked why he'd left, he told one reporter, "I kept asking, are we going to rest next month? And we never did. I wanted to get in shape before the age of 30 so I could have a chance at the rest of my life. I was afraid something inside me was dying. Leaving was an act of survival." I felt really bad for him and was terribly torn. Bernie and I were good friends, and I hated to see him leave, especially under such a cloud. We had had great times together in Gainesville, in Daytona Beach with the Allman Brothers, and on the road with the Eagles. From the first time I ever met him, waiting at the Greyhound station in a '63 Ford Falcon, we had hung out, chatted, gotten high together, and played good music. I had known him since I was a teenager, and he was one of the closest friends I'd ever had. With Bernie's departure and my inability to patch things up, I realized that my pacifist policy was going to be sorely tested. To my mind, Don and Glenn were seizing full control with Irving's blessing, and anyone who opposed them would be gone, and I was powerless to stop it. I couldn't bring myself to leave with him, so I suddenly found myself completely isolated. A tremor of fear ran through the band and rippled down through the crew. With the new power dynamic, the Eagles began to function by maintaining insecurity. Would Randy be next? Or me? Neither of us knew. We all wondered about our long-term future. The loss of Bernie could so easily have been our downfall. Until that point, he was actually the musical foundation of the band, being such a gifted multi-instrumentalist. Would this new direction we'd been pushed into even work? Would radio stations accept new rock songs from an essentially country band? We were quietly confident, but we didn't actually know. The doubt, fear, and worry caused even more upsets. The threat of further eruptions kept everyone walking on eggshells, feeling as if they should try to appease Don and Glenn. The original Democratic band now seemed to me like a two-man dictatorship. Many wars were lost in silent combat. Opinions often went unsaid for fear that words would light the fuse that blew this band to hell. On December 20th, 1975, Irving Azoff issued a press release officially announcing Bernie's departure and the signing of his client Joe Walsh as the newest Eagle. The decision had been made in a matter of weeks, although Don had initially taken a great deal of convincing. He thought it was a colossal risk and worried that Joe's strident musical personality would not fit well with the Eagles. We were the most successful we had ever been, having found the right combination of country and rock to appeal to all tastes. And yet Irving was suggesting we take on an out-and-heavy rocker whose arrival would surely herald a radical transformation of our sound. Joe had been a friend of the band for some time, coming around to the studio to hang out and play with us after sessions, and I would personally welcome a few dueling jams with him on stage. But for many, he seemed a little too wild for the Eagles. Apart from his solid rock career with the James Gang and songs like Rocky Mountain Way, he had a reputation for being a maverick. Irving convinced us that Walsh wouldn't overshadow the rest of us and wouldn't be allowed to play anything but our music. Irving insisted that he didn't want people to think the Eagles were finished. We had to replace Bernie right away and get back out on the road. There was still an image of cohesion on stage and in the media. Irving tried to minimize the public damage by enforcing a news blackout, refusing to let any of us talk to reporters for fear that they might see what we had become. He denied that there were personality conflicts and claimed that Bernie genuinely wanted to pursue a solo career. No other candidates were suggested, and Joe Walsh was given the greatest Christmas present on a plate: membership in the Eagles. Bernie had just walked away from the whole deal, leaving the remaining four of us as Eagles Ltd. The transition wasn't as easy as Irving had suggested. Joe's voice was much more nasal than Bernie's, and the sound of the vocal harmonies changed dramatically. Joe's performing style also couldn't have been more different. He was a showman, accustomed to leaping around the stage, jumping off risers, and playing spectacular solos. He was soon put into his place. After an initial burst of activity on stage, he started to toe the line, following Don and Glenn's strict instructions that every note in every show on every night had to be played verbatim, like on the record, without variance. All the steps were choreographed, including all the guitar moves and where we went on stage in between songs. It was like a theatrical production. You could have written those charts out and had anybody play those pieces. I feared that the precision playing and obsession with perfection made for a rather dull show. Yeah, sure, it's great to hear a live performance played exactly as you know it and love it on the record. Perfect if you want to sing along or clap or follow the lines. But wasn't the whole point of a live show that it was live? That you were seeing your idols for the first time and watching them actually perform? I wasn't the only one who felt that way. I know Randy and Joe were frustrated too. Rolling Stone magazine commented that by eliminating spontaneity, particularly a Walsh-Feldner guitar jam, the Eagles sacrificed any chance of creating a new on stage and reaching a higher peak. Personally, I like Joe a lot. What wasn't there to like? He's such an easy-to-love character, like a favorite drunken uncle with a bunch of crazy toys, a ready cachet of funny stories, and a great sense of humor. Lord knows we needed to laugh. It was often mind-numbingly boring and lonely being on the road for weeks and months on end, and dealing with that was hard enough sober, much less when we were hungover, out of drugs, or feeling sick with sinus infections from bad blowout at Cuba. So we had to find ways to stay entertained. Joe already had a reputation as a legendary hellraiser, And given enough gin, that's exactly what he was, turning adjoining rooms into one giant suite with the help of a chainsaw, cutting the legs off all the furniture in Irving's room to suit his diminutive height, and jamming coins into bedroom doors so they'd not open. In Chicago, I heard, he once pushed a grand piano out of the window onto the hotel manager's car after they refused to let him into the restaurant without a tie. He was also a great one for starting water fights. We wrecked one whole floor of a hotel in Evansville, Indiana, by knocking on people's doors, using Irving as a front man, and throwing ice buckets full of water at them when they opened up. He once painted the windows of a roadie's hotel room black so that he thought it was still night when he woke up in the morning and went back to sleep. Joe would get a key to your room, turn the spigot on the bidet, and close the bathroom door so that by the time you arrived, the room would be flooded. With a glue gun, he'd glue hotel doors shut. He'd glue the handset to your telephone and then ring your room at 4 in the morning, knowing you couldn't make it stop unless you ripped it from the wall, which, of course, you eventually did. After Joe arrived, nobody ever returned a rental car in one piece or walked away from one in perfect condition. Joe's voice would come crackling over the walkie-talkies he'd bought us all at Radio Shack, just as we parked in the lot and walked away. "Hey, Fingers, what the do you think you're doing? It's only a rental, man." So we dumped the cars on the curb right outside the airport with the seat belts cut out, the alarm or ignition disabled. Joe delighted in going to toy stores and buying just about every new gadget they'd had. He'd come back to the hotel with remote-control cars or helium blimps that we could steer around in the grand lobby or the rest of the hotel. After the walkie-talkies arrived, he gave everyone a call sign, including himself. His was Jose, although we also called him Rubber Nose because he had this great big rubbery nose up which alarming quantities of cocaine would disappear. "Yeah, that's a big 10-4, Whiskey A Go-Go." My call sign for Irving was 411 because that's the number you dial for information. When someone claimed it was also his height, it stuck. We spent huge amounts of money on batteries for the walkie-talkies to make sure we could reach each other day and night. The radio would crackle to life at 4 a.m. and a voice would say, "Hey, you still awake?" "Yup, am now." "You got any left?" "Yeah." "Okay, I'll be right down." Joe was not at all confrontational and would acquiesce graciously to whatever Don and Glenn said, even if that meant he had to be virtually glued to the stage to stop him from moving around. However, his general stress of being on the road had to come from somewhere, and the rest of us encouraged him because it allowed our own rage to be released by proxy. The more frustrated he became, the more pride he took in his work off stage, especially playing bumper cars with rental vehicles or throwing televisions out of hotel windows. Irving joined in the fun by buying Joe an electric chainsaw. It had its own special carrying case and was much quieter than a conventional one. You wouldn't know what old Rubber Nose was up to until the blade started coming through your wall. Joe and I had become friends long before he joined the Eagles. I had played a couple gigs with him, one at Dodger Stadium, and I had helped him with a live record and a TV show he fronted called Joe Walsh and Dr. John. We played well together. The best lesson he taught me was how to adjust your phrasing so as to play behind someone without detracting from the solo. As a lead guitarist, it isn't always easy to allow someone to step forward into the spotlight and play while you're supporting them. Between us, we learned that little two-step, a sort of musical dance. Joe's attitude was very laid back. He had been in the business long enough to know what was what. He probably thought that this was the best gig he could get, and it beat being out there by himself. He'd often complained about being a solo artist, although from my experience it seemed to me that it would be so much easier than being in a band. He set me straight. "No, man, it's a pain. You have to do everything yourself, approve all the photographs, set up all the touring dates, go to all the rehearsals, and oversee all the decisions. I'm sick and tired of it." Now, he could be a well-paid sideman in a great rock band and wouldn't have to bother with that stuff anymore. He stayed out of the fights, only ever adding his 5 cents worth if his opinion was invited. With all the upheaval going on in the band, plus touring and planning the next album, I didn't have very much time to spend with Susan, who was in the final stages of her second pregnancy. My visits home were all too short, and I missed her and Jessie more than I can say. I did manage to attend some LeMay's classes in Malibu with her, however, to remind us of the breathing techniques involved, and when I could be I was a totally hands-on husband. One of the other fathers to be in the class was Adam West, who played Bruce Wayne, alias Batman, in the popular television series. He was in his mid-40s and into his second marriage, and I'll never forget sitting alongside him on the floor, each of us cradling our heavily pregnant wives while urging them on. His looks and voice were so distinctive that every time he said, "Breathe," or "Push now," Susan and I half expected the Penguin or the Joker to come flying through the window and attack him with an umbrella. The band took a couple weeks off for Christmas in 1975, our second with little Jessie, and the first at our beach house in Malibu, so I was there for the crucial part. I remember in the week between Christmas and New Year's, Susan was so pregnant that she could barely walk, but she stripped, put on her bikini, and did a sexy model pose for a photographer standing in our hallway. We were laughing so much, I thought she might go into labor then and there. I was home with Susan on the morning of December 31st when her water broke, and I drove her to the hospital in Encino. We chose one in the valley because we knew the roads would be clear at holiday time, and because they had the best facilities available. It was quite a hippie thing for husbands to be at the birth and involved in the breathing. The labor was pretty straightforward this time. I remained at Susan's side throughout, without fainting, cut the cord, and welcomed our little girl to the world, before buying champagne for all of us and the nurses to help celebrate New Year's Eve. Much to her chagrin, Rebecca Felder will always be a true Valley girl. My mother was still in mourning over the death of my father, but for Christmas that year I presented her with a handmade card. "Open it," I told her, smiling. She did so and carefully read the words inside. I promised to buy her any house she wanted in Gainesville. "I mean it, Mom, any house you like. I can afford it now." "What's wrong with the one I've got?" she asked, confused. I thought of that little shack with its tin roof and no air conditioning and winced. By the time she returned home from her visit with us, I thought I'd won her over to the idea, but I never did. She went to look at a few properties at my insistence, but there was always something wrong. She'd tell me, "I don't know the neighborhood," or "It's too far from church," or "All my friends live on the other side of town." Marnie, Jerry's wife, was extremely patient with her and drove her around to see house after house, but she never liked any of them. It was too much of an emotional wrench for her to leave the family home. It was paid for and it was safe. For 40 years, it was all she had ever known. I had to content myself with redoing it and buying her a new car instead. She chose a Chrysler New Yorker to replace Dad's last car, a rusty Oldsmobile Rocket with over 200,000 miles on it. The record label wanted another album, but a lawsuit made this difficult. In early 1976, David Geffen was in the process of selling his remaining financial interest in Asylum to Warner Communications. Believing that he was including Eagles' copyrights in the sale, Irving Azoff filed a $10 million suit against Warner for their return. Though later resolved, the action complicated the production of a new album. Joe Smith, an executive at Elektra, once described Irving humorously at a roast as a little bundle of hate. He was well aware that we were becoming Warner's biggest act, and later, he was right. When we were selling 1 million albums a month, Irving's suit meant Warner might have to wait longer for another album. Joe Smith tried to work things out, but negotiations dragged. We kept touring while the talks stalled. In March 1976, Joe released a greatest hits album on Elektra/Asylum to buy more time. None of us had a say in the decision. We hadn't the slightest inkling how successful it would become. A week after its release, Eagles, their greatest hits 1971 to 1975, had sold 1 million copies. It became the very first album certified platinum by the Recording Industry Association of America. It remained on Billboard's Top 200 for 2.5 years and is still one of the best-selling albums of all time. The pressure was on. If our next album didn't sell more than our greatest hits, fans would think our new material was inferior to what we had recorded in the past. It was an added pressure we could have done without. The trappings of success were ours by now, especially when we went on the road again for a 26-city tour that summer to introduce Joe to our American fans. We took Learjets the way other people took taxis. We drank champagne like water and snorted almost enough cocaine to finance a small third-world country. Fast cars were bought, mansions were purchased, and jewelry was bestowed. We'd rib each other about what luxuries we had in our hotel rooms just to wind the others up. It was our way of coping with the absurdity of making all this money, but still being able to walk down Sunset Boulevard without being recognized. In the early days, the desk clerks at the hotel usually assigned rooms at random. They didn't know one player's name from another, and most hotels only had a couple suites anyway. Sometimes I'd get the presidential suite, sometimes Don would. It was a lottery. One day we were all in an elevator in a Holiday Inn somewhere, en route to a gig, when I said, "I really like my room, but the jacuzzi in my bathroom is noisy as." The others all stopped and looked at me. "You got a jacuzzi in your bath? I didn't get one." I grinned. "Well, mine has bubble bath oil and everything." Glenn's face was like a thundercloud. Somewhere else, a few weeks later, we stayed at this beautiful hotel, and my room had a grand piano in the living room. I thought it was fantastic. I sat and played it for a while. During the elevator ride down to the limos that were taking us to the gig, I said, "How's everyone's room?" "Cool," they all said. Without a hint of a smile, I said, "Mine's nice, but that grand piano's out of tune." Everyone groaned. "Yeah, right." "No, really, I have a grand piano in my living room." "Sure, Feldner," said Don sniffly, "just like the jacuzzi in the Holiday Inn." We all laughed. After that, Glenn and Don somehow always had nicer suites and cars. I told myself, you know what? I don't give a. All you do is sleep in the room for a night or two and then move on anyway. One of the earliest causes of disagreement was the number of hired hands Don and Glenn took on. Joe and Randy and I had virtually no one, apart from the odd guitar tech to help with our stuff, but Don and Glenn hired lots of people, including a masseuse who traveled with Don for his bad back. Glenn's tennis coach was on the payroll, of which I was paying a fifth to help handle luggage. He had never been on the road before and was inexperienced. On one tour he lost a $1,500 leather suitcase of mine with about $3,000 worth of Italian suits in it. Man, I was mad. I was paying this guy, and yet he wasn't even looking after my interests properly. My only assistant was my guitar tech, Jimmy Collins, who lived in Boston. When we came off the road, he'd go home to Boston and would receive a very small retainer to be on call. Don and Glenn's guys remained in L.A. and were given titles like Transportation Manager and Ground Transportation Manager, in charge of rental cars and limos. They even had a van paid for by the Eagles, with which Don Henley's guy ran errands for him and Glenn. I lived out in Malibu and had no help whatsoever. Once I got out of the airport and put my luggage in a rental car, that was it. I was on my own. I once dared to complain about it to Irving. I was paying for all these lackeys, and I thought it was only fair to confront Irving for my sake and for those in the band too afraid to say anything. I asked Irving, when these guys are off the road and aren't actually working for the Eagles just for Don and Glenn, shouldn't they pay for them, not for the rest of us? Irving told me in no uncertain terms that this was the way it was going to be. "Stop complaining and stop being so cheap," he snapped. Having come from such a dirt-poor background, I had always been the least extravagant member of the band. Something inside my head warned me that I could lose my wealth as quickly as I had made it. Even sending my kids to private school seemed excessive. The most I'd ever spent money on was a guitar. I once paid $3,500 for a 1959 Les Paul, just like the one Mr. Lipham had sent to be remodeled and then sold out from under me to that customer from New York. One day, after flying home for a visit, I drove past a Porsche showroom in Beverly Hills and decided on impulse to stop. Strolling in, wearing jeans and sneakers, my long hair lank, I smiled at the clean-cut salesman and pointed to a 911S in the window. "I'll take it," I said. He looked up at me with a smile. "Sure," he said disdainfully. "No, really," I said. "I'll take it. Can I drive it away?" It took half an hour and a fax from my business manager before he believed me. I drove away that afternoon in the $16,000 beauty, feeling almost ashamed. It was a far cry from my '59 Volkswagen Beetle in Gainesville. What would my father have said? What would he have said, too, about my drinking? The man who only ever had the occasional beer wouldn't have approved of my new habit. I never really drank that much until I was in the Eagles and discovered tequila and peyote, a psychedelic cactus used by the Indians since ancient times for spiritual purposes. Made famous by the man who inspired the band's name, Carlos Costenda, especially in his 1974 book Journey to Ixtlan. It generally produces nausea before its transcendental effects begin. One night, we played somewhere like God's Hole, Indiana, and we had a party after the show. I took some peyote and drank much more than usual before ending up back in my hotel room. I was so unbelievably drunk that I crawled into the bathroom on my hands and knees and threw up. It was about 2:30 in the morning, and the phone began to ring while I was leaning over the toilet bowl, my face pressed against the cold porcelain. I couldn't move. The phone stopped, rang again, stopped, and rang again. Eventually, I crawled back to the bed and lay partly on it, with my knees on the floor, and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Susan said, waiting for me to say something. All I could manage was, "Dawn? Dawn, are you okay?" "No," slurring the words I said. "I drank too much tequila. I'm really sick." At that point, I passed out and collapsed onto the floor. I woke up, and I don't know how much later, and heard her shouting, "Dawn, are you okay? Dawn, speak to me." I managed to reassure her before collapsing again, this time into sleep. When I woke the next morning, I had a hangover I could have sold to science. For 3 days, I felt poisoned. I had hardly touched tequila since. Joe, whose nicknames included Meathead, was a legendary drinker before he went straight. He drank anything that didn't drink him first, mainly gin or Jack Daniels, but also Tullamore Dew whiskey and Courvoisier brandy. "Just a wee drop of the dew," he used to say in a phony Scots accent while pouring another 3 fingers. Courvoisier was like rocket fuel. It burned my throat every time, except after a few snorts of cocaine. Then it slid down real smooth. It was so strong, though, that I had started getting drunk and need more blow to even out the buzz. It soon became a constant juggling act between the two. With Joe's help, I discovered that midway between a coke high and a brandy high was a very happy place to be. This became my combo of choice. Apart from the damage to my liver and my nose, the chief change that success brought to my life was that suddenly everyone wanted to be my friend. People came out from under every rock. They tried to get to me through my brother, mother, or old high school friends in Gainesville. People I hadn't seen or heard from in years appeared on my radar. Someone would call my mom and claim to be an old high school buddy of mine who needed my telephone number. Or Jerry would get a call at work from someone who claimed I'd asked them to keep in touch, but they'd lost my address. Each had great investment ideas for my money, and kept trying to find unique ways to take advantage of my generosity, kindness, or naiveness. Even peripheral family members tried to get something from me. They had a newfound enthusiasm for our relationship. Before the fame and money, none of them paid very much attention to what I was doing. I suspect they shared my father's view that I was a complete waste of time. Disillusioned and disenchanted by the shallowness of success, I tried to associate with those who knew me before I had made it. I began to wonder about people's sincerity. Who was reliable? What were their motives? Who should I trust? Paranoia began to set in. Between tours in preparation for the next album, Don and Glenn rented a house together. It once belonged to Dorothy Lamour and was located high in the Hollywood Hills. The whole of Los Angeles spread below it. They lived like the odd couple, one tidy, one a slob. The cloud had definitely lifted since Bernie left, and Don and Glenn became closer than ever. They were riding buddies and drinking buddies. On occasion, they'd even go out and try to get laid together. It was all about success and excess. Too much, too fast. Glenn spent a lot of time drinking long-neck buds or red wine. He prided himself on his appearance and preferred the mean, broody look with his trademark Mexican mustache to reel them in. Don sported an afro haircut, a gold chain, and shirts wide open so you could see his chest hair. Had dated just about every LA model or actress on the circuit. Decadence led to ruthlessness and ultimately a sense of paradise lost, a recurring lament in the songs they wrote together. Groupies were a common feature of the wild early parties, but Don's discrimination and discretion increased with his wealth. He began dating high-class, high-profile women and would arrange to have them come out on the road one after another, because the quality of groupies for the 3 parties were very inconsistent from town to town. From what he considered the weakest part of the tour, he'd import girls from L.A. Glenn did that too. That really was a step too far. After 2 serious relationships ended with the women leaving him, Don began a 2-year on-off relationship with Stevie Nicks of Fleetwood Mac, the band that was our major rival in the charts, and who were on the road as much as we were. He began paying for her to be flown between Eagles and Fleetwood Mac gigs in a Learjet, endangering the band's new catchphrase, "Love 'em and lear 'em." They eventually split up. None of us ever really bothered to make friends with Don's women. There were so many. It wasn't possible. You'd just get friendly with one and she'd dump him or he'd dump her, and another would come along, the latest Bond girl or a newer model. He didn't poke his nose into my marriage, and I didn't interfere with his relationships. Stevie and I became friends later and have remained friends to this day. I've done some work with her, but our friendship was always separate from her relationship with Don. Some of Don's best songs came out of his various heartbreaks. In fact, J.D. Souther and Glenn would almost root for him to break up so we could get some more good songs. I didn't socialize with Don and Glenn very much, not that they ever asked me to. I went out with Randy and Joe occasionally, and the three of us often rehearsed over at Randy's, putting a few licks together, but the concept of us being best buddies never materialized. Apart from Randy and his long-distance marriage, I was the only one married with kids anyway, and I wasn't into hanging around the Troubadour night after night or attending their home-based 3E parties. Once I came off the road, I embraced the family life I had in Malibu and hung up my Eagles persona of a hard-drinking, drug-taking rock star, leaving it like a costume waiting for my return. I often tried to break the ice with Don and Glenn, but it always felt like a professional relationship. When we first met, anyone could say or do anything, and there was a sense of us all being in it together. As the fame and the stakes got bigger, the rest of us were less included in any of the decisions, until it got to the point where we became intimidated and didn't like to ask. It was like being at an office party where your boss is there all the time. You just couldn't relax. Among the crew, the word went out that Don and Glenn were in charge now. Nobody would do anything to challenge that. Least of all the poorly paid crew members, only too happy to be affiliated with such a successful band. Band members became known as the Gods. Larry Scoop Solders, our PR guy, was the first to use the expression. I started referring to just Don and Glenn as the Gods, and even Irving picked up on it and called them that behind their backs. The lines were drawn, and Randy, Joe, and I were definitely mere mortals. Drugs had always been a feature in our dissension, but by now, we could buy as much as we liked whenever we liked. Cocaine was the drug, adored by many in the film and music industry. It became increasingly difficult to be in the recording studio with four guys who were snorting so much cocaine. It would be late, 1 or 2 in the morning, and they were all still raring to go. To keep up, or in some instances lead them, I sort of fell into that level of use and abuse. Before I knew it, my consumption had spiraled, and I was doing half a gram a day. I'm not sure how many grams some of my fellow band members were up to, but I would guess nearly 2. I blame the drugs more than anything for what happened with the Eagles. It was fine when we were all just having a few beers or smoking weed, but hard drugs corrupt and distort and magnify paranoia and self-doubt. The great gifts we had as a musical unit were being horribly abused. The spiraling use of cocaine caused us to waste incredible amounts of time obsessing over things we couldn't even really hear. It became hard to tell if a note was actually sharp or flat. But in the drug-induced fog, we decided this detail simply had to be resolved. We'd spend countless hours doing stupid stuff, overworking ourselves, and pushing already strained relationships still further. There was this running joke. It would be 3 or 4 in the morning, and someone would say, "Well, I'm going to do this last line, then I'll go right to bed." Which was ridiculous. One more line and the last place you're headed to is bed. Soon it would be 5 in the morning, then 6, and before we knew it, another day had dawned. The next day, I'd feel real bad. I'd wake up with a headache and a hangover, especially if we'd mixed it with booze. I'd immediately want to make myself feel better by doing more below. I'd do just enough to get a mild buzz, then drag my butt back to the submarine atmosphere of the studio, where everybody else felt equally burned and singed around the edges. In this way, we'd all try to cope with a stressful creative environment, combined with all the physical and emotional problems that too much cocaine use can produce. The music we made had always been the one good thing we did together. Now, even that was in danger. We finally decided as a group to try to remain close to clean and sober as possible while we were playing and tracking our songs. To maintain some continuity from take to take and day to day, we just had to. While coke sometimes had a positive impact, inspiring lyrics and so on, it ultimately had a negative effect. Don and Glenn publicly projected unity, but privately they had a huge breakup. Both of them, meanwhile, began to fall out with Randy. The Eagles went from a bunch of young guys hanging out together, smoking weed and drinking a few beers, to 5 men who couldn't stand each other. Everything was reeling out of control. Not that I was going to complain. I only had to look around at my house, my wife, and my kids, my Mercedes, and my Porsche to know that I was onto a good thing. Regardless of the bad times, nothing I had yet experienced was going to make me blow this scene. I was going to work as hard as I could, play my best, write as many songs as possible, first at rehearsals and the last to leave the studio, and be as diplomatic and easygoing as I possibly could. Anything not to have the wrath of the gods focused on me. I honestly didn't know how much I had in the bank back then. As far as I was concerned, until I got a call to tell me I was broke, I didn't want to know. I had made it. I was a rock and roll star, and the business managers could see to the cash flow. Well, that's the end of Chapter 11. Let me know what you guys thought of Chapter 11 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.